was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortunate he has been, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
عاش الجيل الصاعد، جيل من شعب مجاهد، عاش يبني ويجاهد، عاش بكفاحه الخالد، عاش يبني ويجاهد، عاش بكفاحه الخالد، راجل واحد مبدأ واحد،
عاش جيل ثورتنا،
عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار، كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد أحرار. عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار، كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد أحرار. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية باسم مبادئ أبية،
وسمعنا بيقولها قوية
ودفاع. أنا رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. أنا خط هجوم ودفاع، أنا رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الجندي العربي عاش.
عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عليه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عليه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. وسمعناه بيقولها قوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش فلاح الثورة عاش.
عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروى حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروى حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
قلبي وروحي ملك الفني والاتنين لبلادي هدية. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الفن رسالة عاش.
عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار فيها مداخن طالع منها لهب النور والنار. عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار فيها مداخن طالع منها لهب النور والنار. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية ده إنتاجي وصنع إيديا.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية ده إنتاجي وصنع إيديا.
حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى، والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايد صدرناه. حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى، والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايد صدرناه. قولوا معايا حيوا معايا
عاش عاش العامل عاش.
عاش الطالب يوم ما طلب العلم كتاب وسلاح، عارف العلم وسيلة تحقق غاية كل نجاح. عاش الطالب يوم ما طلب العلم كتاب وسلاح، عارف العلم وسيلة تحقق غاية كل نجاح. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية في الإعداد وفي الكلية.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية في الإعداد وفي الكلية.
العلم سلاح جبار بيحول ليلنا نهار، يسعى للنور بالنور ويواجه النار بالنار. العلم سلاح جبار بيحول ليلنا نهار، يسعى للنور بالنور ويواجه النار بالنار. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الجيل الصاعد عاش.
عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. ثورة مارد للحرية هب ونادى بالقومية.
ثورة مارد للحرية هب ونادى بالقومية.
ردينا عليك يا جمال وايدينا في ايديك يا جمال، وطلعنا معاك يا جمال نبني وياك يا جمال. ردينا عليك
يا جمال
وايدينا في ايديك
يا جمال
وطلعنا معاك
يا جمال.
نبني وياك يا جمال. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش عبد الناصر عاش.
Утреннего стяг в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжается бой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.
И звон продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
Right, is that better? Because for some reason OBS had decided to take the mic off. So if the sound's back, let me know, and if there are any lip readers out there, you can tell what I said. Okay. Let me know if the sound issue has resolved. Okay, so it would appear we have some resolution now. I'm going to keep talking anyway. Let me just check the levels. Yes, there we go. Whenever you update the streaming software system, all the settings go to hell. So there we go. So today we are looking at the European Union. Now this is a follow-up from yesterday's discussion of the report by Harold Kuyat and Michael von der Schulenberg, where we were talking about the reasons for the Ukraine war, and we went into a long discussion of the way in which that was a deliberate choice by US imperialism and its European vassal states. And today I'm going to be revisiting the subject of Europe, because I think that the whole idea of Europe is a poisonous one, and I'm going to get to why that is. Because to outline in brief, first of all, though, what thesis I'm going to be outlining to you over the course of the next hour or two, is that the idea of Europe, the idea of a unified Europe, it's been floating around since really the late 19th century at the very least. Though, of course, there have been in the earlier capitalist period and indeed the pre-capitalist period various ideas and indeed practices that took us towards a unified Europe. You want to go back a long way, you can go back to the Roman Empire as a prototypical example of this, perhaps in the period of antiquity. But if we look at modernity, there's of course the attempt to unify Europe by Napoleon Bonaparte. There was the attempt to manage the contradictions between the European powers after the end of the French Revolutionary Wars after 1815. A system of Metternich and others managing the various different disputes between the states. There's the long period of peace or relative peace after 1870 and the defeat of Napoleon III and the Paris Commune that ultimately concludes 44 years later with World War I. So in that period of time, there were various different ideas floating around about a unified Europe, and Lenin pointed out that the only way to regard these ideas of a unified Europe was that this was something which could only ever be regarded as wholly reactionary if it was constructed on the basis of capitalism, because of course we were in the period of imperialism. And he pointed out that the slogan of the United States of Europe, unless this is a Europe that is ruled by the proletariat, is only going to be reactionary. And this slogan of the United States of Europe was kicking around a lot before and indeed after World War I. So what I want to put to you today is that Lenin's, of course, prediction has been borne out, but more than that is that the bourgeois powers, the capitalists of Europe, were chronically, fatally, in fact, weakened by World War I. They staggered on for 20 years, then involved themselves in World War II, when the contradictions got too great again, following German imperialism's attempt at a violent comeback. And the aftermath and the period of over 78 years now since the end of World War II has been one where essentially the Europe, bourgeois, increasingly unified Europe, the European imperialist bloc, has come to be essentially just an extension of the power of American imperialism. But there was an illusion and a delusion that many believed in, that Europe was going to be this independent actor, this independent entity known as the European Union. And I want to try and dispel that today. Many of you will already believe that to be a load of old bullshit anyway, but I think that the through the prism of the Ukraine war and the response to what's happening in occupied Palestine, and a look back over the period of the so-called Cold War, we can see the reality of what Europe, as in the European Union, or before that, the European Community, actually is. So, I will pause now to just greet everybody who's in the chat. So, Tobias, who was indeed first, Peter from Perfidious Albion, Healthy Harold from Down Under, Banana Bender, same as well. Jay over in Norfolk, Virginia. Jerry, good morning to you. CJ says, greetings from Richmond, and he appreciated the lengthy response yesterday. And Harold is down in Brisbane, and glad to be able to join at the new time. Tobias is appreciating the music. HM, our viewer in Brighton. HM, I believe that the Eddie Izzard is a thing that is happening to Brighton now. My sympathies. I hope that the swine doesn't get in. Greetings to also Cosmos and Red Star Betty, who's coming in off a night shift, so he's in the Twilight Zone. Munis, hello to you. Will Johnson, good morning, and good, is it evening, to Brian out there in Japan. And so, returning to the subject of the European Union. Here I will also reference some sources for comrades to read if they want to do further research into the things that I'm saying here today. So the principal works that are informing my comments here today are works by, of course, Lenin's work on imperialism, which everybody should read if you haven't already. But the one I found useful for the interwar and post-World War II period was Michael Hudson's Super-Imperialism. Now, if you've heard my broadcast before, you will know that I have significant disagreements with Hudson's political conclusions. His reading of Marx I find to be completely inaccurate, and I find his political side of his analysis pushes towards essentially the view that with the proper, shall we say, Keynesian applications of economic theory, that capitalism can evolve its way to socialism, and that's what he argues that the PRC is doing at the moment. I disagree with that on a number of levels, but I also disagree with his views on the Soviet Union, which I find to be very Trotskyite. But as an economic historian, putting aside his political conclusions from that history, and as a scholar on the usage of debt, Hudson's work is very useful. So his work on super-imperialism, the early chapters where he chronicles the usage of debt by the US after World War I and the chronic problems that put France and Germany in, and also his analysis of the system that was built after World War II, contains many useful details, even though there are elements with that analysis with which I disagree. And also the work of Andrew Kleiman on the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Again, I disagree with Kleiman's political conclusions, Kleiman coming out of a Trotskyite tradition, but Kleiman's work on the tendency of the rate of profit to fall I find useful on the basis that he puts it in a good historical context, and he provides mathematical foundations for his work as well. So he provides a lot of supporting equations and graphs and calculations with regard to the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, which I find useful. I disagree with Kleiman's conclusions because he puts probably too much emphasis on the tendency of the rate of profit to fall being the central part of the Marxist understanding of the crisis of capitalism. But in terms of somebody who's done a lot of work on fleshing out in real terms the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, that book, the book he did on this, is useful to read, but bear in mind the limitations of his conclusions. but the work itself is very much worth reading and understanding, and it can inform an analysis of especially the post-World War II world that most of us will have grown up in. The other sources I would reference was I've referred to the books and the blog of Michael Roberts, which again, he comes out of the Trotskyite tradition, so I have disagreements with a lot of his political conclusions, but his work is always informative, and if nothing else, he draws from an interesting variety of sources, so you can follow those references up to find the right to find the original sources that he uses as well. And of course also the book by Tony Norfield, who's a former city trader and regards himself as a Leninist. His work named The City is a very good guide to the contradictions within the US imperialist bloc that over time have all resolved themselves in favor of US imperialism. And his analysis of the role of the City of London and the friction that has existed between the British and the US imperialists over the years that is always generally resolved mainly in the interests of US imperialism. So those are some sources which I would suggest that you look over for further reading on this. And with that, I'm going to begin. I've seen Lachlan's question in the chat, so I will come back to that at the end of my opening gambit here. So, to go back to first principles here, the creation of the European Union comes out of the destruction of World War II. And it originally takes the form of the European Coal and Steel Community. And it's not until slightly later in the 1950s when you get the coming together of what became known as the European Economic Community, or EEC, founded by the Treaty of Rome. And that initially comprises just Western Europe, and largely, but not exclusively, overlapped with NATO membership. And the reason why this was put together after World War II with the active intervention of the US imperialists was because, as well as a unified military bloc to be wielded not just against the Soviet Union and the people's democracies of the East, but also against domestic rebellion. We've covered before what the real reason for the Gladio stay-behind armies were. It wasn't really about training to go after the Soviet Union, because nobody really and seriously believed that the Soviet Union was actually going to launch some kind of invasion of Western Europe. It was always propaganda. What Gladio operations were for was, of course, going after the domestic communist parties and the domestic wider, more radical end of the left and the more radical end of the trade union movement. That's what that was about. And of course, running destabilization operations inside European countries. That's what the Gladio operations were and are. So that's which is, of course, an integral part of the NATO structure. They are a means by which American imperialism exercises influence and tries to maintain its hold through covert means. And remember that American imperialism built the military and security structures of most of the countries of Western Europe after World War II, or rebuilt them, or aided them in being rebuilt. And even those that weren't were significantly influenced by US imperialism, such as France. And of course, Britain integrated its security system increasingly after World War II, but especially after 1956. So to start there with the reason why the unified Europe on an economic basis begins, it begins through the active intervention of the US. So the ideas of the various characters in Europe who were like Jean Monnet, like the former Nazi Walter Hallstein, were put into place was to act as essentially an anti-communist, a unified anti-communist bloc economically. NATO was the unified anti-communist military alliance run by the United States largely, and the EU was to be the economic unification of a very damaged Europe. The US imperialism had underwritten the revival of the capitalist powers in Europe, but they also had to, of course, revive themselves. They attempted to regain their colonies, and look at what happened with the Dutch in what's now Indonesia, France in French Indochina, now Vietnam, and then, of course, Algeria. But of course, the British in Malaysia and in Kenya and other places. So they tried to hold on to these profitable colonial acquisitions, but failed to do so. So paper independence, at least flag independence, was on the cards and pushed through there. So the unification of these countries became important because in a time when the various different African and Asian and South American nations were not only becoming independent, but were increasingly trying to break out of imperial domination to varying degrees of success, often inspired by the Russian and the Chinese revolutions. They needed, that is, the imperialists needed to unify their efforts to preserve their influences in places like North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia, which had previously been dominated by European imperialism. Their economic influence could only be maintained by increasingly coming together. And Soviet analysis of this done in the 60s of how the various different blocks came together to exploit the newly independent nations of Africa, and how they used various different international institutions to do so. The Soviets were studying this up until the mid-80s, when Gorbachev shut all that down in his sordid attempt to do a deal with imperialism. And those studies are still available online. I will post them again in the Telegram group if I can dig them out. But the point is that unification was necessary due to weakness. And this weakness goes back, as I said in the introduction, to World War I. And, of course, World War I was generated by the enormous and unresolvable contradictions of imperialism. They could only be resolved through the mass destruction of war. But afterwards, of course, it created an enormous problem for the ruling classes, as Hudson notes in his work, which is that they were all chronically indebted. They were all chronically indebted first and foremost to the United States. He's pausing for coffee there. And they'd all taken loans from the United States, particularly the French and the British, and these took the form of direct monetary loans, but also lend-lease style arrangements in the form of the sales of weapons, or the granting of weapons on a loan-type basis to Britain, because Britain didn't have enough industrial capacity to actually produce all the weaponry it needed to fight the war. It had mobilized all the industry that it had to meet its war production quotas, and it still needed to import weaponry from the United States. And that and the monetary and the direct loans in monetary form caused enormous problems for the British and the French after World War I, which, as Hudson notes, caused them to push the Germans harder for reparations. So you got this absurd cycle that is outlined in Hudson's work. I think this is one of the reasons why he's worth reading, where the British and the French were paying exorbitant loans off. The Americans were very insistent that every penny be paid with interest. And so you get the British and the French making payments to the United States, and then the British and the French would press the Germans for greater payment on the reparations that had been dictated by the Versailles Conference, which many observers, including John Maynard Keynes, thought was ultimately going to be suicidal. So the British and the French then pressed the Germans for increased payments on the reparations bill. The Germans then went to the United States and borrowed money so that they could pay the reparations. The United States then insisted on payment from the British and the French, and the British and the French went to the Germans to extract money from them, and the Germans then borrowed that money from the United States all over again. You see the vicious circles of capitalism in action here. Now, of course, the only one who's really being strengthened by this is, of course, the US imperialists. And this cycle went on all the way through the 1920s, as long as the US was prepared to keep loaning money to the Germans. Ultimately, though, with the end of the 20s, the Wall Street crash and the beginning of the Great Depression, the United States both stops loaning money and then starts being more aggressive in calling its loans in. And they were calling the loans in from the Germans and the British and the French with ever greater aggression. And so when you look at like the chronic weaknesses of British imperialism, well, to a large degree, they'd already been there. Now, they'd already developed up before World War One. That, as Marx notes in Capital Volume 2, deindustrialization is inherent to capitalism, and he notes that that's early on in Capital Volume 2, and in the version I have, that thought is expanded by an explanatory footnote from Engels. I'll post the direct quote on the Telegram group later. But the point is that, as Marx noted and then Lenin developed upon, capitalism in its European and British form goes over to imperialism, and this, of course, leads to things such as the scramble for Africa, because, of course, it becomes more profitable to export capital into locations overseas that were more readily available for hyper-exploitation. And this crisis of capitalism, this crisis which, of course, leads up to 1914, is a crisis of deindustrialization, of increasing export of capital, and a rotting away of the British industrial base. In fact, there are some observers who state that the British industrial base had been declining really since the 1840s, that its peak was reached by the 1840s, and after then, American industry started outperforming the British, particularly with regard to like the beginning of like mass assembly via like production lines. Rather than things being done by individual craftsmen, that was perfected more in the United States than it was in Britain. So by the time you get even into the pre-American Civil War period, American industry, having of course been built up by the investment of British capitalists, was outperforming British capitalism already. It was out competing it. It was out innovating it. So with that in mind, what would have been necessary for the British capitalists to actually keep up to speed with American capitalism and German capitalism, both of which, by the way, British capitalists invested heavily in both Germany and the United States all the way through the early to middle part of the 19th century, and in Germany especially in like the 1850s, 60s and 70s. And of course, irony of ironies, which is that their investment in Germany especially helped create a rival for them, which ultimately led to World War One. So anybody who's looking at what is going on with regard to the United States and China right now should look back at the policies or the tendencies of British capitalism in the early to middle 19th century, which is that it invested very heavily in the United States in the very profitable enterprise of building up American industry, as well as, of course, being heavily dependent upon cotton produced in the slave states of the South, but also invested heavily in Germany to the point where the British ruling class suddenly, in the 1890s and the early 20th century, they suddenly realized that they'd produced a rival that was outstripping them economically on every single level. It was outperforming British industry in coal production, steel production, and things like the laying of railways, and the almost every single industrial sector, other than some very specialized ones which Britain was still ahead in. I believe Britain was still ahead in terms of competition with Germany in like the chemical industry, for instance. But in most other industrial sectors, by the early 20th century, Germany is racing ahead of Britain. And for the British ruling class to actually resolve this problem that they had with being outcompeted by Germany and the USA, then it would have taken a gigantic amount of inward investment in order to actually modernize their production methods up to the same level as was being used in Germany and the USA. And they never did that, by the way. The British capitalist class did invest in some new plant and machinery and some new modern production methods, but they remained laggards in terms of investment. And this is what was behind what was referred to in the 70s as the British disease. And it was because Britain had low rates of growth and declining competitiveness when it comes to industrial products with certainly West Germany as it was at the time, the United States, and in terms of the car industry with France and even with Italy. Now, this is always compared by bourgeois analysis, or always blamed by bourgeois analysts on the, it's militant trade unions. Militant trade unions stopped investment. Well, that's not the case, because what you actually have in the case of British British industrial decline is a 100-year plus story of relative decline that dates to the 1850s, where they start getting outstripped by the US, 1870s, where they start getting outstripped by the Germans, and then there's this long period of decline where the British ruling class are investing everywhere other than Britain. So they're investing in India to a certain degree for the purposes of extracting more profit, of course. They're investing in places like what's now the country now known as Ghana. They're building up certain industrial bases in South Africa, in what's now known as Zimbabwe, usually based around just the extraction of raw resources and some processing of them and the shipping of them elsewhere. But that's where certain investments are going, because it's very profitable to run a gold mine in what was called then Rhodesia, or southern Rhodesia, because of course you can treat the African workers like crap, hyper exploit them, and that makes a gold mine over there incredibly profitable. Makes it more profitable than a gold mine, for instance, in Cornwall, where of course there, even back in the 1920s, with how rough miners were treated back then, they still had the MFGB, Miners Federation of Great Britain, to represent them. In the earlier days, no such thing existed inside southern Africa. So the pushing of capital out of the country relentlessly, due to, of course, this is what happens with imperialist countries, meant that plant and machinery is not updated without significant state investment to underwrite it. British capitalist class becomes more and more parasitic, and it's the same with all of the ruling classes in the imperialist countries. The point that I'm making here is that the British ruling class in the 20s and 30s, when it was heavily indebted to US imperialism, responded not by innovating, or not by trying to build up or build out or modernize their industrial base at home, simply tried to exploit the colonies more. They tried to squeeze more out of India, Malaya, and the African nations. Rather than trying to revitalize their system, they simply became more and more parasitic. And so when you're looking at like the European Union, for instance, what you have is, because Britain didn't join it straight away, of course, but in its early period it consists of a rebuilt West Germany, which was rebuilt after the destruction of World War II by loans and direct investment from American imperialism, and the forgiving of war debts as well, and the waiving of any reparations. So the thing they learned from World War I and the Versailles Treaty was that, due to the fact that they had now a socialist bloc facing them in Europe, the capitalists needed to be a bit more, shall we say, flexible with their allies. So they create the European Union. They revitalize German industry, French industry, and Italian industry. And of course, the American imperialists do the same thing with Japan through the the war of aggression on people's career, they invested heavily in rebuilding the Japanese industrial base. Now, again, coming to the 1980s, you see American imperialism fall prey to the same thing that British imperialism did, which is that they invested in German manufacturing and Japanese manufacturing, and they end up getting outperformed by both, so then tried to sabotage both. But we'll come to that later on in the story. So the building of this imperialist construct called the European Economic Community was meant to pull the economies of Western Europe into alignment with each other. Initially, it's quite small. It consists mainly of the Western European countries that were most badly damaged by World War II. It's expanded in the 70s to include, of course, Britain, Ireland, and then Spain and Portugal and Greece, and most of the countries of Southern Europe. And there's always talk in the into the 70s and into the 80s that this is going to come to the point where it reaches strategic autonomy vis-a-vis the United States. And this is something which has been explored in the work of various different Marxists, particularly those who were around, like the Ralph Miliband School of Thought, who argued that I think Nikos Poulantzas argued this as well, that the European Union would become an independent actor on the world stage due to the fact that it would inevitably its interests would clash with the US, and that it would be maybe a pivot point between the US and the people's democracies in the Soviet Union. Tragically enough, this was also something that was believed by various leadership groups inside the USSR itself that came to full power with the disastrous reign of Gorbachev, but also the period earlier than that, in the Brezhnev period. There were those inside the Soviet leadership who actually believed that Europe, the European countries, had some kind of strategic autonomy. Now, let's answer this question of whether that was ever true. Now, in the case of the West Germany under Brandt in the late 60s, early 70s, it's often said that, oh, well, West Germany enjoyed a degree of strategic autonomy because Brandt was able to do Ostpolitik and recognize various borders and mend relations to a certain degree with East Germany. I'd say that doesn't represent the picture here. I would say that the policy of Brandt was actually quite in line with the policy of the Nixon administration. And to explain how, the Nixon administration, following the disaster it was facing in Vietnam, needed to recalibrate its approach. And so the Nixon-Kissinger approach was to try and cut deals with both the Soviet Union and the leadership of the PRC, People's Republic of China, hopefully encouraging the rivalry between the two, but also to try different approaches to managing relations with both. And they, of course, signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. They started the process of trying to manage the nuclear weapons programs. And so when Brandt goes to recognize and also restore better relations with East Germany, the DDR, he's actually in line with the way that US imperialist thinking was going anyway. And Brandt's building of a relationship with the leaders of the DDR actually was something that was tremendously beneficial for the imperialist bloc, because what did it encourage? It encouraged the pro-capitalist, pro-reunification tendencies within the SED, the East German Party. And so this idea that, oh, Willy Brandt, the great independent actor on the world stage, isn't necessarily true. He might have pursued a slightly different line to the rabidly hostile line pursued earlier in the Adenauer period, but it was largely in line with what US imperialism was doing anyway, which is pursuing slightly different tactics in the early to mid-70s than it had pursued previously. It needed to take a step back from open aggression following its defeat in Vietnam and try a different tactic. And the tactic of so-called détente, I would argue, did encourage the growth of liquidationist tendencies inside the USSR and the wider people's democracies, sort of Soviet bloc. And so it did reap rewards for US imperialism, perhaps even more so than naked aggression did. And so the strategic autonomy of West Germany is also revealed to be a complete fraud when you look at how the US, and again Hudson covers this in his work, were able to do things like place the full burden for US military bases inside West Germany onto the West German state. They got the West Germans to pay for the occupation forces. And this underlines the point here about how much independence these nations ever truly have, because when the US actually wants to get something done to benefit the US ruling class, they are always able to lean on the European states. So they're able to quite easily lean on the West Germans to get them to pay up the cash for US military presence in West Germany. They are able, through the Plaza Accords, to get the Japanese to essentially sabotage their own economy. That ultimately leads to the catastrophic crash of the late 80s, early 90s, from which the Japanese economy has never fully recovered. And of course, they steal large elements of the Japanese microprocessor industry to boost themselves at the same time. Now, I will go back and do a specific episode on the Plaza Accords at a later date, but because it requires a much more detailed explanation than I'm going to give here. But suffice to say, they are able to lean heavily on West Germany and on Japan when they need to, as they are able to on the British and on the French as well, for all the French pretensions at independence. But let's go forward. So we have the European community, European Economic Community becomes the European Community in the early 90s, and then becomes the European Union. And it becomes the European Union, especially after the Maastricht Treaty in 1992, when it becomes an attempt at creating a unified system. Like, it becomes much more of an apparent state itself. So the post-Cold War period was the time when certain people, even in Marxist circles, expected that the European Union would be able to become a fully independent entity, or Europe would become this autonomous zone, collaboration of countries, or perhaps even a superstate that was able to set its own terms of trade, to not just be a place where the US had sole control anymore. And if you've listened to the program for a while, you'll have heard the interviews we've done with people like Kit Clarenberg, who has written about how the Europeans tried to actually reach their own settlement in the former Yugoslavia, for instance. Not something that was actually good for the Yugoslavs. They still wanted to break up that country. But what they were doing was that they were trying to find a solely European solution to this conflict, which of course involved the former British Foreign Secretary David Owen heading up a European negotiating team to try and resolve the issue there. And the US imperialists, of course, were vehemently opposed to that, and so they told Izetbegovic, the head of the Bosnian government, that, well, whatever you want, we got you back. If you want more out of the Serbs or out of the Croats, we'll keep arming and funding you until you're ready to say that you've achieved your objectives. Now, of course, this was a manipulation, and what they wanted to do, though, was they wanted to sink the European bid to resolve this conflict through negotiations. As soon as they'd sunk that, and the Europeans had to turn back and say, well, we can't proceed unless we have the US on board. As soon as they got that recognition that any settlement had to be essentially run by them, Then they dropped Izetbegovic and the Bosnians and says, well, now you have to sign anything we put in front of you. And even Izetbegovic rather bitterly observed later on that the deal that he got was worse than the deal that was earlier on offer, that the US completely fucked them. And this is a very familiar story. But the point was that that was an attempt by principally the Germans and the French to exert joint European diplomatic pressure to find a solution to a war that they'd been very happy to engage in, just because it caused the breakup of Yugoslavia, and then they wanted to bring it to a close on their terms, and they were unable to, because the US is able to exercise a gigantic influence over its puppets, and they were, of course, completely unable to counteract that. So, into the 90s we go, and into the period building up to European Monetary Union, the EMU project, as it was once called. And the euro will, when the histories are written on this, come to be seen as one of the worst disasters in the long decline of European capitalism. This idea was, of course, favoured principally by the German capitalist class. They hoped that by having not only a single market, but zero barriers to trade, so zero barriers to capital, zero barriers to, in terms of the exploitation of labour. And the Euro project was a big part of this. And if you look at how German manufacturing benefited from this in the early years, they were able to significantly damage the remaining industrial bases of places like Greece, flooding the market with, of course, the more competitive German manufactured goods. And having no barriers to trade, they were able to annihilate many different areas of European manufacturing and replace it with imports from Germany. And this was, of course, one of the big objectives. And so German capitalism stood to gain an awful lot from this. French capitalism did too, because they had a stronger economic base, a stronger industrial base, I should say. And, of course, by further unifying themselves into the European Union and conducting their trade negotiations via a collective bloc, they were able to exercise far more power over areas in particularly sub-Saharan Africa, where previously they'd been dealing with them on a state-to-state basis. By bringing the European Union's trade arrangements together, they were able to exercise much more economic pressure upon African nations to essentially restore or keep in place the kind of neo-colonial hyper-exploitation of their resources and their labor that Kwame Nkrumah first identified in his work on neo-colonialism in the late 1960s. So European integration aids their attempts at neo-colonialism, certainly, and they inevitably wanted to push the idea of European strategic autonomy further. Now, of course, the US imperialists have always been opposed to this. They always had in mind that Europe, as if it was going to be unified, would remain unified under the control of the United States. Now, there is an old Soviet cartoon from the 1950s, which I think is apt here, which is where you've got all the nations of Western Europe and the United States all sat around a bar on stools, and each of them is shaking hands with one hand and soaring through the struts of each other's stools with the other. And to a certain extent that's the case, but I think now it's more and more the case that the sole soaring is being done by the US itself. Now, the French and the Germans, but particularly the French ruling class, were invested in the idea of further European integration. Now, that means further integration in terms of not just economically, so it would mean not just the euro, but further economic integration. So you already have the disempowering of any of the euro members' ability to set their own interest rates and to deal with their own debts, but more economic integration, continent-wide economic planning from a capitalist point of view, in truth. And this was an idea that the French ruling class were playing with. They were also wanting an independent European military component to the European Union. Again, this is something that the US was vehemently opposed to, and this is why the US wanted to keep Britain inside the European Union, because, of course, the British would always go apeshit whenever this was mentioned. And I remember the controversy over this 20 years ago when the Jacques Chirac, the French president, was keen on this, talking about the need for an independent European military and the need to build that up. And of course, the British reliably blocked it because the British ruling class, their purpose of being in the EU, principally, was to essentially act as the most reliable vessel for US interests. That's part of the reason why they joined, was to make sure that the project would remain crippled and unable to move forward. Now, it would have been largely very difficult to move forward with a integrated European superstate anyway, regardless of the role of the British or the US ruling class. But again, that was the role the British were playing. They saw the British ruling class is divided, as I've said before, between those who wish to further integrate themselves with continental Europe and those who wish to tie themselves basically up into becoming the 51st state of the United States. And it's those people, the latter, who are the most rabid in favor of intervening for Israel, and also the most rabid in terms of carrying on the Ukraine war. Though it should be said the pro-EU element is very keen on the Ukraine war as well. Now, the European military side of this never really got off the ground. The superstate side of it was always stymied. The Euro project was dodgy from the off. And I say this because initially they wanted to keep it limited to the most powerful economies. Then they decided that they were going to include the weaker Southern European economies and the Irish economy. And so they essentially rigged the initially very tough qualification rules for admittance to the single European currency, to the euro. They bent them so far in order to get Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and Ireland in order that their economies could be more efficiently exploited by German and French capitalism. And so they basically guaranteed that the euro would be a further destruction of the actual independence of all these countries. And if you go back on the podcast archive, you can revisit the interview I did this time last year with Thomas Fazi, and he provides a very interesting account of the very negative effect on Italy of euro membership. And it has essentially removed any political independence that the Italian state actually had. And that was a deliberate choice by the Italian ruling class, and a choice that they continue to defend to this day. So the point is, though, that even with the euro being launched, the German ruling class were split on the further development of Europe. On the one hand, there were some of them who were keen on developing this European superstate idea further. But on the other hand, there are those within the German ruling class and those within the German political structure who are wholly tied to the interests of US imperialism. As I've covered before, US imperialism invests a gigantic amount of capital into Europe and rinses a lot of its capital that it exports through Europe. Now, Europe is the principal destination for US foreign direct investment, and that's grown in actual fact over the last 20 years. So as the European Union tried to exert or the French and the Germans, or particularly the French, tried to steer more in the direction of the strategic autonomy line, the American imperialists upped their capital investment in Europe bit by bit by bit. And you can see this on the website of the American Bureau of Economic Affairs. You can see the amount of capital exported into Europe every year. You can see it's been growing year on year for at least 2 decades now. And the point about this is that it was a concerted attempt to make sure that any attempt at escaping the influence of the United States or enabling the EU to act independently from the United States was crushed. And what also crushes it, of course, is the decline in relative terms of the strength of the capitalist class in France. It is, of course, declining all the way through the 90s. It's carrying out more and more attacks on the French working class, withdrawing the many concessions that were made in the 60s and 70s, though in truth that process had been going on since Mitterrand flipped from being a reformist to being a counter-reformist in the early 1980s. So French capitalism has been getting weaker and weaker. And as we can see through current events in the Sahel, you can see that what they were doing was, as their competitiveness and their place in the world rankings of economic power slipped and slipped, they lent more and more into trying to exploit and hyper-exploit the CFA franc area in the old colonial possessions, which of course ultimately generates the rebellions that form the basis for the progressive military juntas that exist in Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso now. So the European states are weakening, but at the same time they're trying to make the European Union more powerful by accepting in all of the old people's democracies, the ex-socialist states, which in one way actually increases the power of US imperialism, given that Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Poland, for instance, are much closer to US imperialism than they are to any of the ruling classes in Europe. In fact, the Polish reactionaries have a very bitter relationship with the German ruling class and are much closer to US imperialism in terms of their alliances. And so the entry of these countries into the EU, and with the EU's Byzantine and complicated voting system, meant that in reality, even though the European Union is bigger, the US imperialist influence in it was even bigger still, because now it had countries within it that were directly tied to the US apron strings, even more than the countries in Europe are now. And so you get the political leadership of Europe, particularly the long reign of Angela Merkel, where on the one hand, Merkel herself was in favor of developing the European Union project to become more of an independent player in the imperialist system. On the other hand, she was also faced with the fact that, again, one of Germany's biggest markets other than China is the US. The US invests a gigantic amount in Germany every year, and this creates, of course, creates a large constituency in the German ruling class that is pro-US. You also have the long-term dominance of the German military and security systems, because of these were rebuilt by the United States in its own interests and in its own image to a certain extent, so that you have a state structure, a military intelligence structure, which is divided and where significant parts of it are tied directly to the United States. So Germany, this now unified country, which should be, of course, in theory, and many people thought that this was going to happen, taking its place as the economic leader of Europe, remains crippled. It remains tied to US imperialism, and it remains politically much weaker than it should be. Gerhard Schroeder, was the last one to try and actually exercise real autonomy in German policy, which is why he came out against the Iraq War. He was all for the Kosovo War, by the way, because the interests of the German ruling class lay in the final breakup of what had been Yugoslavia. But he and Chirac shared a certain vision, which is that they wanted to be able to pivot between the different emerging places in this, what's now known as the multipolar world. They wanted to be able to pursue their own line with China. They wanted to be able to pursue their own line with Russia. Both Schroeder and Chirac were keen on keeping relations open with the Russians. Of course, the US has always been militantly opposed to that, and they were able to stymie that process. And once, of course, the leadership of Schroeder had gone and Chirac had gone, you get Sarkozy in France, who immediately carpets himself before US imperialism and wants to publicly declares he wants to be ever closer to the US. You get Hollande, who's basically just a cipher, is nothing. And then you get Macron, who still talks about European autonomy and that NATO is brain dead. But then the US rings him up and says, no, it's not. You're doing this. and exerts its pressure, and the French crumble because the French bourgeois is incredibly weak, and it's getting weaker by the day. And again, like the only reason it was really holding on to its influence in the Sahel was more down to the fact of its collaboration with US imperialism than it was to its own military strength, which was, again, getting weaker by the year. So all of this combines together to give you a picture where the European Union, which by many, according to analysis done by people like, there's a paper which we analysed on the old form of the show back on the podcast when Layla was my co-host, by I believe it's by Leo Panich and Sam Jindin, the Canadian post-Trotskyists, I think they are, who thought that the European bloc was going to become more and more autonomous. It's become less and less autonomous because its primary driving economy with the Germans and its primary political force, the French, remained mired in relations that provided dominance to US imperialism. And that is certainly the case to this day. And it remains the case. And so the argument I would make is that they have never truly recovered from the devastating impact of World War I and World War II, that the US rebuilt this system. As Stalin put it, they put Europe on rations after World War II. There was a period where, due to West German economic growth, people thought that this was going to escalate into some independent system, some independent entity. But in reality, it was just not the case anymore. And the decline of Europe, the stagnation and decline of its economies, the continued US political domination over the European system has guaranteed that effectively what is happening here is that the European Union that exists now is essentially a large Potemkin village. It has no substance to it really anymore. It is essentially operating as a large sort of US puppet operation. Its populations are increasingly restive and divided. Many in places like France now despise the European Union for various different reasons and want to see a French exit from it. And so this reactionary dream that was the dream of Jean Monnet and Walter Hallstein and others has turned out to be just another vehicle for US power. In the end, all the delusions about it are washed away, and now it is revealed for what it always was, which was essentially another vehicle for US imperialism that people got deluded about and thought was a real thing, was going to be a real counterbalance for US imperialism, but it's now emerged as just another vehicle for it. And everybody can see that now. Even the Russian ruling class and the Russian ruling group around Putin, who wanted to secure a long-term positive relations with the EU bloc, have come to the conclusion that that Europe is not worth talking to. All they do is represent the voice of US imperialism in slightly different accents. And the Chinese are coming to that view as well. They might have wanted trade relations with Europe, they still do, but it's a system that has come to an end. It's an experiment it's a system of relations which is only dominated by one player, and that player is in Washington, D.C. So, coming to up to the hour today, so I'm going to bring it to a conclusion for today. What I'm going to do is, because I've got to get on, is I'm going to note these questions down and then come back to them in a video I'm going to put out tomorrow. So thank you to everybody who's tuned in today. I'll be back with you again with another one of these tomorrow. And I will be back again with another episode of the reading group on Patreon covering Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. But until tomorrow, thank you for tuning in, and I'll be back with you again very soon.
Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make